On a busy Saturday evening in downtown Seattle, the warm glow of string lights illuminated the entrance of The Copper Pot, an upscale Italian restaurant known for its authentic cuisine and sophisticated ambience. The restaurant's owner, Mr. Chen, took immense pride in maintaining the establishment's prestigious reputation, perhaps a bit too much at times. That particular evening, a young couple walked in, their clothes slightly wrinkled from their long day at work. The woman wore a simple sundress, while her partner had on a clean but well-worn button-down shirt and khakis. They'd been saving up for months to celebrate their 5th anniversary at what they'd heard was the best Italian restaurant in the city. As they approached the host stand, Mr. Chen happened to be passing by. His eyes narrowed as he took in their appearance, making a snap judgment based on their modest attire. The couple smiled warmly, explaining they had a reservation under the name Singh. Mr. Chen's expression remained cold as he scrutinized his reservation book. "I'm afraid there must be some mistake," he said curtly, despite clearly seeing their names on the list. "We're fully booked this evening." His tone carried an unmistakable hint of dismissal. The couple exchanged confused glances. "But sir," Mrs. Singh spoke softly, pulling up the confirmation email on her phone, "we made this reservation 3 weeks ago. It's our anniversary, and we've been looking forward to this evening for months." Mr. Chen's demeanor grew increasingly stern. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the casual dining establishment down the street," he suggested, his voice dripping with barely concealed contempt. "We have certain standards to maintain here." The husband's face flushed with embarrassment, but he maintained his composure. "Sir, we understand your restaurant's reputation. That's exactly why we chose to celebrate our special day here. We've saved up specifically for this occasion." But Mr. Chen remained unmoved. "I'm sorry, but I must ask you to leave," he insisted, gesturing toward the door. "We cannot accommodate you tonight." Several nearby patrons began to notice the exchange, their expressions a mix of discomfort and disapproval at the owner's behavior. As the dejected couple turned to leave, a well-dressed elderly woman at a nearby table stood up. Her presence commanded attention, and Mr. Chen's face suddenly paled as recognition dawned in his eyes. She was Mrs. Wang, the city's most influential food critic and restaurant investor, known for her unexpected visits to establishments she was considering featuring in her widely read column. The story of what happened next would soon become the talk of the local restaurant community, teaching Mr. Chen a valuable lesson about judging people based on appearances. But more importantly, it would spark a chain of events that would transform not only his restaurant but also his perspective on what truly makes a dining establishment prestigious. The couple stepped out into the cool evening air, their anniversary plans in shambles, unaware that their unfortunate experience was about to catalyze a significant change in the local culinary scene. Meanwhile, inside the Copper Pot, Mrs. Wang gathered her belongings, her expression stern as she prepared to address the situation in a way that would leave an indelible mark on everyone present. The lights of passing cars cast moving shadows on the restaurant's windows, and the gentle hum of evening traffic provided a backdrop to what would become one of the most memorable nights in the Copper Pot's history. The events that would unfold over the next few hours would not only challenge Mr. Chen's prejudices but also remind everyone present about the true meaning of hospitality and human dignity. As the night air grew cooler and the city lights began to twinkle more brightly, no one present could have predicted how this simple act of discrimination would spiral into a story that would touch hearts and change lives. The real question wasn't just about a denied dinner reservation anymore, it was about human dignity, respect, and the power of standing up for what's right. Mrs. Wang's heels clicked purposefully against the hardwood floor as she approached Mr. Chen. The restaurant's usual dinner buzz had quieted to a hushed silence, with other diners watching the scene unfold. She'd been quietly observing the entire interaction while finishing her risotto, and the displeasure evident on her face made Mr. Chen's confident demeanor waver. 25 years I've been reviewing restaurants in this city, she began, her voice carrying across the now silent dining room. And never have I witnessed such a clear betrayal of what the hospitality industry stands for. She gestured to the door where the couple had just left. Those people you just turned away. I watched them walk past my window every morning for the past year, heading to the children's hospital where they both work as nurses. Mr. Chen's face drained of color. He hadn't known, couldn't have known, but that was precisely Mrs. Wang's point. The other diners began to whisper among themselves, some pulling out their phones, undoubtedly sharing the unfolding drama on social media. But Mrs. Wang, Mr. Chen stammered, I was only trying to maintain our establishment standards. She cut him off with a raised hand. Standards? Let me tell you about standards. She pulled out her phone and pulled up an article. That young man you just dismissed? He was featured in the local news last month for working 36 hours straight during a major emergency, saving multiple lives. His wife organized a free clinic for underprivileged children in her spare time. These are the people you deemed unworthy of your standards. Outside, the couple walked slowly down the street, their anniversary plans in ruins. Mrs. Singh wiped away a tear as her husband tried to console her. They'd been looking forward to this dinner for months, putting aside a little money from each paycheck to afford what they'd hoped would be a memorable celebration. Back in the restaurant, Mrs. Wang wasn't finished. She turned to address the other diners, many of whom were now recording the interaction. I came here tonight to consider featuring the copper pot in my upcoming article about restaurants that are redefining fine dining in our city. I wanted to highlight establishments that understand that true luxury isn't just about expensive ingredients or fancy decorations, it's about creating moments of joy for every guest who walks through your doors. Mr. Chen stood frozen, watching as his dreams of a glowing review from the city's most influential food critic crumbled before his eyes. But Mrs. Wang wasn't interested in simply shaming him, she had a different lesson in mind. Mr. Chen, she said, her tone softening slightly, I know your story. You built this restaurant from nothing, working your way up from a dishwasher to owner. You, more than anyone, should understand that appearance doesn't define worth. The reminder of his own humble beginnings hit Mr. Chen like a physical blow. Memories flooded back of the many times he'd been judged by his appearance, of the doors that had been closed in his face, of the struggles he'd endured to reach his current position. Meanwhile, the Singhs had reached the end of the block, about to turn the corner when they heard someone calling after them. It was one of the servers from the copper pot, running to catch up with them, slightly out of breath. Please wait, the young server called out. Mrs. Wang, she's one of our most respected customers, she wants you to come back. Please. She insists. The couple hesitated, the sting of their recent humiliation still fresh. But there was something in the server's earnest expression that made them pause. The night air had grown cooler, and the street lamps cast long shadows on the sidewalk as they considered their options. Back at the restaurant, Mrs. Wang was sharing her vision with Mr. Chen. You have an opportunity here, she explained. Not just to right a wrong, but to set an example for the entire industry. Your food is excellent, your service impeccable, but tonight you forgot the most important ingredient in hospitality, humanity. The other diners watched intently as Mr. Chen's expression shifted from defensive to thoughtful. In the span of just a few minutes, his carefully constructed world of superficial prestige had been turned upside down, and he was beginning to see his actions through a new lens. As the Singhs reluctantly followed the server back to the restaurant, they had no idea they were about to become part of a story that would change not just their evening, but the entire culture of fine dining in their city. The night was far from over, and the real transformation was just beginning. The string lights outside the copper pot seemed to shine a little brighter as the couple approached the entrance once again, their hearts pounding with uncertainty about what awaited them inside. The next few moments would prove that sometimes the most meaningful changes come from the most uncomfortable situations, and that true class has nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with how we treat one another. As the Singhs re-entered the copper pot, the atmosphere had transformed completely from their first visit. The earlier buzz of casual dinner conversation had been replaced by an expectant hush. Every eye in the restaurant turned toward them, making Mrs. Singh grip her husband's hand tighter. Despite their professional lives being dedicated to helping others in high-pressure situations, this moment of being the center of attention made them both uncomfortable. Mr. Chen stood near the entrance, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine remorse. The past 15 minutes had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself, and as he watched the couple he had so rudely dismissed earlier, he saw not their clothes or their appearance, but their dignity, the very thing he had failed to acknowledge before. Mrs. Wong approached the couple, her warm smile a stark contrast to their earlier welcome. "I apologize for asking you to return," she said gently, "but I believe sometimes the universe puts us in unexpected situations for a reason. Would you do us the honor of staying?" The husband looked at his wife, silently communicating in that way long-term couples often do. The hurt was still fresh, but there was something compelling about the sincerity in Mrs. Wong's voice. Before they could respond, Mr. Chen stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "Before you decide," he began, "I need to share something with you, with everyone here." He gestured to the dining room at large, aware that his next words would likely end up on social media, but for once not caring about the restaurant's image. 30 years ago, I arrived in this city with nothing but a dream and $200 in my pocket. He paused, collecting his thoughts. The restaurant remained silent, every person present understanding they were witnessing something significant. My first job interview was at a restaurant much like this one. I had put on my best clothes, which weren't very good, and the owner took one look at me and said they didn't need any help. I spent that night hungry, sleeping on a bench in the park. Mrs. Singh's expression softened slightly as Mr. Chen continued. Eventually, I found work as a dishwasher at a small diner. The owner there, she didn't care what I looked like or where I came from. She cared that I worked hard and treated people with respect. His voice cracked slightly. Somewhere along the way, as I built this restaurant, I forgot that lesson. I became the very thing that once hurt me, and for that, I am deeply ashamed. One of the regular customers, an elderly gentleman who had been dining at the Copper Pot since its opening, dabbed at his eyes with his napkin. He wasn't alone, Mr. Chen's raw honesty had touched many in the room. "I understand if you want to leave," Mr. Chen continued, addressing the Singhs directly. "But if you're willing to stay, I would be honored to serve you myself tonight. Not as the owner, but as someone who needs to remember what true hospitality means." The couple exchanged glances again. Mrs. Singh spoke first, her voice gentle but firm. "My parents taught me that forgiveness is not just about pardoning others, it's about creating space for growth and change." Her husband nodded in agreement. "We see a lot of pain and suffering at the hospital," he added. "But we also see incredible moments of human connection and transformation. Maybe this can be one of those moments." Mrs. Wong beamed, her eyes twinkling. Then it settled. She turned to address the other diners. "Tonight, we're all going to be part of something special. Mr. Chen, I believe you mentioned earlier that you've been working on a new menu that combines your traditional Italian dishes with influences from your own cultural heritage?" Mr. Chen looked surprised. He had indeed been experimenting with fusion dishes in the kitchen, but hadn't felt confident enough to put them on the menu, worried they wouldn't fit the restaurant's image. "Yes, but—" "Perfect." Mrs. Wong interrupted. "Let's make this evening about breaking down barriers, all of them. Would you be willing to share some of these dishes with us tonight?" The energy in the restaurant shifted palpably. Other diners began murmuring in interest, several asking if they could try the new dishes as well. The previous tension dissolved into an atmosphere of anticipation and excitement. Mr. Chen led the Singhs to the best table in the house, normally reserved for special occasions. As they settled in, he surprised everyone by removing his formal jacket and rolling up his sleeves. "If I'm going to serve you properly tonight, I need to be in the kitchen. Would you trust me to create a special menu for your anniversary celebration? The couple agreed, touched by his transformation. As Mr. Chen headed to the kitchen, Mrs. Wang took a seat at their table. Mind if I join you? I have a feeling this is going to be a meal worth writing about, though perhaps not in the way I originally intended. The evening was transforming into something none of them had expected. Through the kitchen doors, they could hear Mr. Chen excitedly giving instructions to his staff, his passion for food and hospitality reignited by the night's events. The other diners, rather than being annoyed by the disruption to their meals, were caught up in the spirit of the moment, many sharing their own stories of times they'd faced prejudice or learned valuable lessons about judgment. As the first of Mr. Chen's special dishes began to emerge from the kitchen, the aromas filling the air told everyone present that they were about to experience something extraordinary. But more than just a meal, they were witnessing the beginning of a transformation, not just of one man or one restaurant, but of the way people could choose to treat each other when given the chance to learn and grow from their mistakes. The kitchen of the Copper Pot came alive with an energy it hadn't seen in years. Mr. Chen moved with purpose between stations, his passion for cooking reignited as he prepared dishes that told not just his story, but represented a bridge between cultures. The sound of sizzling pans and the aroma of garlic, ginger, and fresh herbs filled the air. The first course arrived at the Singh's table, handmade pasta delicately infused with Sichuan peppercorns, served with a sauce that married traditional Italian marinara with subtle Asian spices. As Mr. Chen presented the dish himself, his hands trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from emotion. "This dish," he explained, his voice soft but clear, "represents my first memory of cooking with my grandmother. She always said that food should tell a story." He paused, looking at the couple earnestly. "Tonight, I want to tell you my story, through these dishes, if you'll allow me." Mrs. Singh took the first bite, and her eyes widened in surprise and delight. The flavors were unlike anything she'd experienced before, familiar yet innovative, comforting yet exciting. Her husband reached across the table to squeeze her hand, both of them realizing that their ruined anniversary was transforming into something far more meaningful than they could have imagined. Other diners began requesting to try the special menu as well. Mr. Chen's staff, seeing their boss's transformation, shared in his enthusiasm. One elderly server, who had worked at the Copper Pot since its opening, later confided to Mrs. Wang that she hadn't seen such joy in the kitchen since the restaurant's early days. As the evening progressed, the barriers between tables began to dissolve. Conversations flowed between strangers, with diners sharing their own stories of prejudice, forgiveness, and transformation. A business executive at a corner table recalled how a chance encounter with kindness had changed the course of his career. A young student described her struggles with being judged for her appearance in the fashion industry. The second course arrived, risotto infused with Asian mushrooms and topped with crispy shallots, a dish that represented Mr. Chen's early days working in Italian restaurants while maintaining connections to his heritage. "When I first learned to make risotto," he explained to the now captivated dining room, "I was terrified of ruining such a classic dish by adding my own touches. But my mentor told me something I never forgot: tradition is a foundation, not a prison." Mrs. Wang watched with satisfaction as she documented the evening in her notebook. This wasn't just a story about a restaurant anymore, it was a story about community, growth, and the power of food to bring people together. She observed how the Singhs, despite their earlier humiliation, had shown grace and forgiveness that allowed for this transformation to take place. The main course was a masterpiece, perfectly cooked veal saltimbocca, but with a sauce that incorporated subtle notes of five-spice and star anise. The dish represented Mr. Chen's present, a confident fusion of his journey and his expertise. As he presented it, he shared another story. "When I first opened the Copper Pot," he said, his voice carrying across the now hushed dining room, "I was so focused on proving myself that I forgot why I fell in love with cooking in the first place. It wasn't about impressing people or maintaining an image. It was about creating moments of joy, about bringing people together. One of the line cooks, who had worked under Mr. Chen for 5 years, wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her boss speak. She had always known there was more to him than his stern exterior, and tonight she was finally seeing it. The Singh's anniversary dinner had become more than just a meal, it had become a catalyst for change. Throughout the restaurant, people were sharing not just food but experiences, breaking down the invisible barriers that too often separate us. A table of businessmen in expensive suits found themselves in deep conversation with a young couple clearly on a budget date, sharing stories and laughter. As the evening progressed, Mr. Chen spent more time in the dining room, sharing the stories behind each dish. His usual rigid posture had relaxed, and his genuine smile transformed his entire face. He spoke about his journey, about the mistakes he'd made, and about his hope for the future. "Tonight has taught me something valuable," he said, addressing everyone present. "In trying to create an exclusive restaurant, I excluded the very thing that makes dining truly special, human connection. From tonight forward, the Copper Pot will be a place where everyone is welcome, where the only standard that matters is treating each other with dignity and respect." The news spread quickly through social media, with diners sharing their experiences and photos of the innovative fusion dishes. But more importantly, they shared the story of transformation they had witnessed. By the time dessert arrived, a delicate tiramisu infused with jasmine tea, the Copper Pot had already begun to transform from just another upscale restaurant into something far more meaningful. Mrs. Wong put down her pen, knowing she had witnessed something special. This wasn't just a story about a restaurant owner learning a lesson, it was a story about how one moment of confronting our prejudices can lead to beautiful transformations. She watched as Mr. Chen presented the Singhs with a special anniversary dessert, his earlier prejudices replaced by genuine warmth and respect. The evening was drawing to a close, but its impact would resonate far beyond these walls. In the warm glow of the Copper Pot's dining room, something had shifted, not just in Mr. Chen, but in everyone who had witnessed this unexpected journey of transformation and forgiveness. The following weeks brought remarkable changes to the Copper Pot. Word of that transformative evening spread through the city, not just through Mrs. Wong's powerful review, but through the countless social media posts and personal stories shared by those who had been present. The restaurant's transformation became a symbol of something larger, a reminder that change was possible, that prejudices could be overcome, and that food had the power to bring people together. Mr. Chen completely redesigned the menu, incorporating his fusion dishes alongside traditional Italian fare. But more importantly, he transformed the restaurant's atmosphere. The strict dress code signs came down. The staff noticed that their boss, once known for his stern demeanor, now greeted every guest with the same warmth, regardless of their appearance or status. 1 month after that fateful evening, the Singhs returned to the Copper Pot. This time, they walked in confidently, greeted by warm smiles from the staff who remembered them. Mr. Chen rushed out from the kitchen, flour on his apron, to welcome them personally. "Every Tuesday," he told them, leading them to their table, "we now host what we call community table night. People from all walks of life come together to share a meal and their stories." He gestured to the long table in the center of the restaurant, which would later that evening be filled with doctors, construction workers, teachers, and business executives, all breaking bread together. The restaurant had become more than just a place to eat, it had become a gathering place where barriers dissolved over plates of perfectly cooked pasta and innovative fusion dishes. The waiting list for reservations grew longer, not despite the changes, but because of them. People were drawn to the authenticity and warmth that now characterized the Copper Pot. Mrs. Wong's review, when it finally appeared in the city's most prestigious food magazine, wasn't just about the food. "The Copper Pot," she wrote, "has achieved something rare in the culinary world, it has found its soul." Under Mr. Chen's transformed leadership, it has become a place where fine dining meets genuine hospitality, where innovation meets tradition, and where everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve. The article included the story of that pivotal night, but it wasn't a story of shame or controversy. Instead, It was a story of redemption, of how one moment of confronting our prejudices can lead to meaningful change. The piece went viral, drawing attention from national media outlets and inspiring other restaurants to examine their own practices. Back in the kitchen, Mr. Chen worked alongside his staff with renewed purpose. He began offering cooking classes on weekends, teaching both traditional Italian techniques and his innovative fusion approaches. More importantly, he shared the stories behind each dish, helping people understand that food was about more than just flavors. It was about connection, history, and breaking down barriers. The Singhs became regular customers, but their impact extended far beyond their patronage. Their story inspired others to share their own experiences of discrimination, leading to important conversations about inclusivity in the restaurant industry. Mr. Chen listened to these stories with humility, using them to further improve his restaurant's practices. One evening, a young couple walked in, clearly nervous and underdressed for what they thought was still an exclusive establishment. They were about to turn away when Mr. Chen personally greeted them, sharing the story of how a similar couple had changed his life and his restaurant forever. By the end of their meal, they were chatting comfortably with diners at neighboring tables, all barriers forgotten. The restaurant's success grew, but not in the way Mr. Chen had originally envisioned. Instead of being known as the most exclusive restaurant in the city, the Copper Pot became famous for its inclusive atmosphere and innovative cuisine. Food critics praised not just the exceptional dishes, but the warm, welcoming environment that made every guest feel valued. 6 months after that transformative night, Mr. Chen hosted a special dinner to commemorate the changes. The Singhs were guests of honor, along with Mrs. Wong and many of the diners who had been present on that fateful evening. The meal began with Mr. Chen sharing his journey. "I used to think success in this industry was about exclusivity," he told the gathered crowd. "I thought creating barriers would make us seem more prestigious. But true success isn't about keeping people out, it's about bringing people together. Every person who walks through that door has a story, has dignity, has value. Our job isn't just to feed them, but to make them feel welcome, to create a space where connections can happen." The evening's menu featured dishes that told the story of the Copper Pot's transformation, from traditional Italian classics to innovative fusion creations that represented bridges between cultures. But more than the food, it was the atmosphere that struck everyone present. Around every table, strangers became friends, sharing stories and laughter. As Mr. Chen watched the dining room filled with people from all walks of life enjoying his food and each other's company, he realized that his restaurant had finally become what he had always dreamed of, truly prestigious. Not because it was exclusive or expensive, but because it had become a place where food brought out the best in people, where prejudices melted away over shared meals, and where every guest left feeling not just satisfied, but valued. The story of the Copper Pot's transformation continued to inspire others in the industry. Other restaurant owners began to examine their own biases and practices. The local restaurant association invited Mr. Chen to speak about creating inclusive dining environments. But perhaps most importantly, his story reminded people that it's never too late to learn, to change, and to become better. 1 year after the night that changed everything, the Copper Pot had become a case study in how a restaurant could maintain its excellence while fostering inclusivity. Food industry publications frequently featured articles about the transformation, but what truly mattered were the countless small moments of connection that happened within its walls every day. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Mr. Chen was preparing for another community table night when he received an unexpected visit. A group of culinary students had come to learn about his journey. As they gathered in the dining room before the evening service, he noticed their diverse backgrounds and varying levels of confidence. Some wore pristine chef's uniforms, while others wore simple clothes they could afford. "When I started in this industry," he told them, moving between the tables as his staff prepared for dinner service, "I thought success meant turning people away. Now I know it means finding ways to welcome them in." He paused at the table where he had first confronted his prejudices that fateful night. Every person who walks through that door carries their own dreams, their own struggles, their own story. The students listened intently as Mr. Chen shared practical lessons about running a restaurant, but more importantly, about creating an environment where both staff and guests felt valued. He had implemented policies that many considered revolutionary in the fine dining world: a living wage for all staff, flexible scheduling for parents, and a mentorship program for aspiring chefs from underprivileged backgrounds. That evening's community table night brought together an eclectic mix of people. A retired teacher sat next to a young tech entrepreneur. A construction worker shared bread with a corporate lawyer. The culinary students stayed to observe, witnessing firsthand how food could break down social barriers. During the dinner service, an elderly couple celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary at the same table where the Singhs had faced rejection a year ago. Mr. Chen prepared a special menu for them, and as he served each course, he shared not just the ingredients but the philosophy behind each dish. This pasta, he explained, presenting a plate of handmade fettuccine with a subtle 5-spice infusion, represents how traditions can blend together to create something new and beautiful. The couple, who had been coming to the Copper Pot since its early days, remarked on how the restaurant had evolved while maintaining its soul. Later that evening, a young server approached Mr. Chen with tears in her eyes. She shared how, before working at the Copper Pot, she had faced discrimination at other restaurants because of her appearance. "Here," she said, "I feel valued for my work, not judged by how I look." The restaurant's success had grown beyond anyone's expectations, but not in the way high-end restaurants typically measured success. Yes, the tables were always full, and the reviews were glowing, but the true measure was in the community they had built. Mr. Chen had started a monthly program where his kitchen staff taught cooking classes to local youth. Many of these young people had never set foot in a fine dining restaurant before, but in the Copper Pot's kitchen, they found mentorship and opportunity. Several former students now worked in the restaurant, bringing fresh perspectives to the menu. The Singhs remained special guests, though they now insisted on paying full price for their meals. Their presence served as a constant reminder of how one moment of confronting prejudice could lead to lasting change. They often brought colleagues from the hospital, creating a regular gathering of healthcare workers who found respite and community within the Copper Pot's walls. Mrs. Wong, who had witnessed the transformation from the beginning, became more than just a food critic. She became a friend and mentor to Mr. Chen. Together, they worked to create industry guidelines for inclusive dining practices, which were being adopted by restaurants across the city. One evening, as the dining room buzzed with conversation and laughter, Mr. Chen overheard a conversation between two guests. One was describing how nervous they had been to enter such a well-known restaurant, but how welcomed they had felt from the moment they stepped inside. "That's the true meaning of hospitality," Mr. Chen thought to himself, remembering his own journey from discrimination to transformation. He had learned that prestige wasn't about exclusivity, it was about creating an environment where everyone could experience the joy of excellent food and genuine connection. The kitchen staff had grown more diverse, bringing different culinary traditions and techniques to the menu. Each chef was encouraged to contribute their own cultural influences, making the Copper Pot's menu a living document that evolved with its team. Regular customers delighted in trying new fusion dishes that told stories of cultural exchange and creativity. Local business schools began sending students to study the Copper Pot's model of inclusive excellence. Mr. Chen would share with them the financial data showing that becoming more inclusive hadn't hurt the restaurant's bottom line, in fact, it had strengthened it. But more importantly, he showed them how creating a welcoming environment had enriched the restaurant in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars. As the evening service wound down, Mr. Chen gathered his staff for their nightly meeting. Looking around the circle at their faces, young and old, from various backgrounds and experiences, he felt profound gratitude. Each person had contributed to the Copper Pot's transformation, making it more than just a restaurant, it had become a place of belonging. The story of the Copper Pot's transformation continued to inspire others in the industry. But for Mr. Chen, the real success wasn't in the headlines or accolades, it was in the small moments of connection that happened every day. It was in the smile of a nervous first-time diner feeling welcomed, in the proud accomplishments of his staff, and in the knowledge that his restaurant had become a place where dignity and respect were served alongside every meal. 18 months after that transformative night, the Copper Pot had become more than just a successful restaurant, it had become a blueprint for change in the industry. On a crisp autumn evening, Mr. Chen stood before a packed dining room, but this time, he wasn't just serving dinner. The restaurant was hosting its first Industry Change Makers Summit, bringing together restaurant owners, chefs, and staff from across the country. The event had started as a small idea, a gathering to share what the Copper Pot had learned about creating an inclusive fine dining experience. But as word spread, it grew into something much larger. Restaurant owners from other cities flew in to learn how they could implement similar changes in their establishments. When I first opened the Copper Pot, Mr. Chen began, addressing the crowded room, I thought I was building a restaurant. Now I realize we're building bridges. He gestured to the diverse crowd before him, seasoned chefs in professional whites, young servers in casual attire, restaurant owners in business suits, all gathered together with a common purpose. The Singhs were there too, seated at their usual table. They had become inadvertent ambassadors for change, their story inspiring discussions about prejudice and transformation in the restaurant industry. That evening, Mrs. Singh shared her perspective for the first time publicly. What happened to us that night was painful, she admitted, her voice carrying across the hushed room. But what grew from that moment of pain has touched so many lives. Sometimes, the worst moments can lead to the most beautiful transformations. The summit featured workshops led by the Copper Pot staff, sharing practical strategies for creating inclusive environments while maintaining high standards. Mr. Chen's head chef demonstrated how they had adapted traditional fine dining techniques to accommodate diverse dietary restrictions and cultural preferences without compromising quality. During a break between sessions, a young restaurant owner approached Mr. Chen with tears in her eyes. She shared how she had faced discrimination in her own journey, often being told she didn't look like a restaurant owner. Seeing what you've built here, she said, gives me hope that I can create something similar in my community. The event also highlighted the Copper Pot's innovative training program, which had become a model for other restaurants. They worked with local community colleges to provide opportunities for aspiring chefs who might not have been able to afford traditional culinary school. Several graduates of the program were now successful chefs in their own right, carrying the lessons of inclusivity to their own kitchens. Mrs. Wong, who had been instrumental in the Copper Pot's transformation, led a session on the role of food critics in promoting inclusive dining. We need to redefine what makes a restaurant prestigious, she argued. It's not just about the food or the decor, it's about creating spaces where everyone feels valued. The summit also addressed the business side of inclusive dining. Mr. Chen shared transparent data showing how the Copper Pot's revenues had actually increased since implementing their inclusive policies. When you welcome everyone, he explained, you don't just expand your customer base, you create loyal customers who become part of your restaurant's family. During the evening dinner service, summit participants witnessed the Copper Pot's philosophy in action. They watched as guests from all walks of life were treated with equal respect and warmth. The menu featured dishes that told stories of cultural fusion and celebration, each plate a testament to the power of breaking down barriers. One of the most powerful moments came when the restaurant staff shared their experiences. A server who had worked in fine dining for 20 years described how the Copper Pot was the first place where she felt truly respected as a professional. A young chef spoke about how the mentorship program had given him opportunities he never thought possible. The summit also addressed challenges head-on. Participants discussed how to handle resistance to change, how to train staff in cultural sensitivity, and how to maintain high standards while being inclusive. Mr. Chen was honest about the mistakes he'd made along the way and the lessons he'd learned from them. As the evening progressed, spontaneous discussions broke out across the dining room. Restaurant owners shared their own experiences with discrimination and their desires to create change. Chefs exchanged ideas about fusion cuisine and inclusive menu planning. Servers discussed how to make every guest feel welcomed and valued. The event culminated in the creation of the Inclusive Dining Initiative, a collaborative effort to spread the Copper Pots model to other restaurants. Participants pledged to implement specific changes in their establishments and to share their experiences with others in the industry. Near the end of the evening, Mr. Chen gathered everyone in the dining room for a final thought. "A year and a half ago, I stood in this very spot and made the biggest mistake of my career," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But that mistake led to the most important lesson I've ever learned, that true hospitality knows no boundaries." He looked around the room, at the faces of people who had come together to learn and grow. Each of us has the power to create change in our own communities. It starts with one moment, one decision to do better, to be better. The summit concluded with a shared meal that showcased the Copper Pot's journey, from traditional Italian dishes to innovative fusion creations that represented the blending of cultures and traditions. As participants enjoyed the food, they continued to share ideas and make plans for implementing changes in their own establishments. When the last guest had left, Mr. Chen sat alone in the quiet dining room, reflecting on how far they had come. The Copper Pot had evolved from a restaurant focused on exclusivity to a catalyst for industry-wide change. But more importantly, it had become a place where moments of genuine human connection happened every day. 2 years to the day after that fateful evening, the Copper Pot was preparing for a very special celebration. The restaurant had been closed for regular service, and the dining room was transformed with soft lighting and elegant decorations. Tonight was about commemorating not just a transformation, but the countless lives that had been touched by one moment of change. Mr. Chen stood in the kitchen, surrounded by his staff, many of whom had been with him throughout this journey. He was no longer the stern, appearance-obsessed owner he had once been. His face had softened, marked by laugh lines that came from genuine joy in his work. The kitchen buzzed with energy as they prepared for what they had dubbed the evening of second chances. The guest list for the night was special. It included many of those whose lives had been impacted by the Copper Pot's transformation. The Singhs, of course, were guests of honor, along with Mrs. Wong. But there were many others, graduates of the mentorship program who now ran their own restaurants, former guests who had found community within these walls, and restaurant owners from across the country who had implemented similar inclusive practices in their own establishments. As guests began to arrive, each was greeted with the same warm welcome that had become the Copper Pot's trademark. The dining room quickly filled with a diverse crowd that would have been unimaginable in the restaurant's earlier days. Business executives chatted with service workers, young culinary students mingled with experienced chefs, and everyone was bound together by their connection to this place and its story. Mr. Chen had prepared a special menu for the evening, each course telling part of the restaurant's journey. The appetizer was the same dish he had refused to serve the Singhs 2 years ago, but now transformed with elements from his own cultural heritage. The main course was a collaboration between his entire kitchen staff, each adding their own cultural touches to create something entirely new. During dinner, people began sharing stories of how the Copper Pot had influenced their lives. A young chef spoke about how the mentorship program had given her the confidence to open her own restaurant in an underserved neighborhood. A regular customer described how the community table nights had helped him find friendship during a lonely period in his life. Mrs. Wong, who had witnessed the restaurant's transformation from the beginning, stood to make a toast. 2 years ago, she began, I watched a moment of discrimination transform into an opportunity for growth. Tonight, I see the ripples of that transformation throughout our entire industry. She gestured to the room at large. The Copper Pot has shown us that excellence and inclusivity are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they enhance each other. This restaurant has maintained its 5-star rating while becoming a place where everyone feels welcomed and valued. The Singh's anniversary had become an annual celebration at the Copper Pot, but this year held special significance. Mrs. Singh, now a regular speaker at industry events about inclusive dining, shared her perspective. "What could have remained a painful memory has instead become a source of hope," she said. "This restaurant proves that when we confront our prejudices with honesty and humility, beautiful things can grow from that discomfort." As the evening progressed, Mr. Chen unveiled a new initiative. The Copper Pot would be establishing a foundation to help aspiring restaurateurs from underrepresented backgrounds open their own establishments. The program would provide not just financial support, but mentorship and guidance in creating inclusive dining spaces. 2 years ago, I learned that true prestige isn't about exclusivity, Mr. Chen said, his voice thick with emotion. It's about creating spaces where dignity and respect are served alongside every meal. This foundation is our way of ensuring that lesson continues to spread. The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause, but the real power of the evening was in the smaller moments, the conversations between people from different walks of life, the shared laughter, the connections being formed across traditional social boundaries. Near the end of the evening, Mr. Chen's head chef presented a special dessert, a fusion of Italian tiramisu and Chinese red bean paste, served with a delicate chocolate decoration in the shape of a bridge. It was a symbol of how the Copper Pot had become a bridge between cultures, between people, between the past and a more inclusive future. As guests prepared to leave, each was given a small cookbook containing recipes from the Copper Pot's journey, along with stories from staff and regular customers. The book's introduction, written by Mr. Chen, spoke of the power of second chances and the importance of remaining open to transformation. The final guests to leave were the Singhs and Mrs. Wong. As they stood at the entrance, Mr. Chen reflected on how that confrontation 2 years ago had changed not just his restaurant, but his entire worldview. "Thank you," he said simply, "for giving me the opportunity to become better." Mrs. Singh smiled warmly. "Thank you for showing us all that change is possible, that one moment of confronting our prejudices can lead to lasting transformation." After the last guest had left, Mr. Chen gathered his staff for their nightly meeting. Looking around at their faces, young and old, from various backgrounds and experiences, he felt profound gratitude. The Copper Pot had become more than just a successful restaurant, it had become a model for how businesses could maintain excellence while fostering inclusivity and dignity. As he locked up for the night, Mr. Chen paused to look at the string lights that still illuminated the entrance, just as they had on that fateful evening 2 years ago. But now they seemed to shine brighter, their warm glow a beacon of welcome to all who passed by. The Copper Pot had indeed become a prestigious restaurant, not because it kept people out, but because it had learned how to welcome everyone in.